Worker groups enables a set of workers to be specifically targeted towards a task execution or a polling trigger evaluation. This gives you control to decide which tasks run on which workers. Useful if you have workers in remote environments that are set up in specific scenarios such as running on Windows, or have specific resources like extra GPU power or extra memory which suits certain tasks in your workflows. I'm going to show you how to create your worker groups inside of Kestra and then assign various workflow tasks to run on those workers. To start with, I'm running Kestra here with multiple components running independently. I've just set this up so it's got two separate workers, but at the moment these workers have no sort of worker group assigned to them or any sort of configuration. So if I was to run a task, by default it's going to just allocate it to either one of these workers with no particular prioritization put in place. Now to create a worker group, I can head over to worker groups here under instance under administration, and then in here I can then create a new worker group. Now I actually have two created here already. I've got one called GPU and one called Windows. For example, you might have a set of workers that have extra GPU power, useful for machine learning tasks, or you might have a worker group set up in a Windows environment, useful if you need to work with specific tools that work best on Windows, maybe like PowerShell. This allows you then to specify specific tasks or workflows to then run on those specific workers. Now to create a new one, we can add it at the top here and we can give it a key. I'm going to call this one example and give it the description example. And when I press save, we'll see that it then gets added here to the top of my list. Now I'm going to go to my Kestra configuration and Docker Compose file so that I can change how my workers are configured so that they'll start using these worker groups. This applies also for Kubernetes, but it might be slightly different. Here's my Docker Compose file. Now I've got a Postgres database and then I've got each of the Kestra components running as their own service. So I've got the Kestra scheduler, which has got my Kestra configuration. We've got the Kestra worker and my extra worker, the executor, as well as the web server. Now, because I've got two different workers here, we can specify these to run on different worker groups. Now, the way to set up your worker to run on a worker group, you should use the command property here. Now, by default, you'll have this set to server and then worker. So you might run the command Kestra server worker, in this case, just server worker. Now, to run a worker group, I just add -- worker group and then the name of my worker. In this case, I'm going to do GPU. And for the other one, I can now use our example one, so we can do -- worker group and then we can put example. So now if I was to open a new terminal and run Docker Compose again, we're going to see our two separate workers get spun up as their own containers, but we'll see that we can now specify which tasks run on each of those workers. So now we can see that we've got our number of different workers here spinning up. So now we'll just come back in a few minutes once this has started up, and then we'll be able to have a look at the UI to see that our worker groups are successfully set up. Now that Kestra has loaded up, we can see that my example and GPU worker groups have one active worker, and the Windows one that I had previously has 0 active workers. In fact, I can click into these and see more information about that worker instance running, and I can see that it's all working correctly. Now let's have a look at an example workflow where we can specify a task to run on this worker. Now here's a workflow that is using plugin defaults to specify 4 script plugins to use the worker group on the key GPU. So when I execute this, we'll see that it's going to run these tasks specifically on our GPU worker group. This is a useful way of being able to run it because this allows you to specify that if you want all of your Python tasks, for example, to run on a dedicated worker set up with a Python environment, then this works great. However, if we wanted, we can specify the worker group property specifically for this one task. So if we want to specify certain tasks to run on certain workers, we can do that. There's also an additional property called Fallback, which is very useful because your worker group may not have workers available. Now there are 3 options for this. By default, it's going to wait. So maybe the work is restarting or it's not quite connected yet. What will happen is the execution will continue to wait until it is available. But you can override this property if you want to be able to tell it to fail if the work is not available or cancel the execution altogether. So here I can specify if I want to use the Windows worker group. We know this worker group doesn't have any workers assigned to it. So when I execute this, we'll see that it's going to fail it immediately because there are no workers available for the Windows worker group. We can also specify this at the namespace level. So I can specify that I want to have all of my workflows inside of the company.team namespace run on, let's say, my Windows worker group. But I can also specify that fallback property so that if there's no workers available, I can tell it to cancel those executions or fail them. You can also do this at the tenant level. So this is very useful if you want to keep data isolated as well, so that certain tasks, or in this case, anything in this tenant, only runs on its own dedicated worker and there is no shared resources between different tenants. And again, you can specify that fallback too in case there aren't any workers available. Hopefully this has given you a good idea of how worker groups work. Now you may be wondering, when should I use these in practice? Now worker groups are great if you need to keep data isolated. You can specify certain workflows in certain namespaces, for example, to only execute on certain worker groups. Useful if they're processing sensitive data that you want to keep away from your standard workers. Another example of worker groups, as we've already discussed, is you may be looking for certain resources for certain tasks. For example, you might be working with some machine learning that needs CUDA resources. So you may have a worker setup that's got access to a CUDA-based GPU. Now that may be expensive to run for every single task in Kestra, but you can make sure that only the tasks that need it execute on that so that you can manage the costs, but also access the performance you need for those workflows to run successfully. Another example may be that you need to execute tasks on a specific operating system. For example, some scripts that you have may only work on Windows, and so you may have your Kestra instance deployed using Linux, but you may need a worker set up in a Windows environment for those specific use cases. In this case, let's say you have a PowerShell script that you need to run. You could specify your worker group to then have that task run on Windows while everything else will continue to run in a Unix or Linux environment. Hopefully that's given you a good insight into how worker groups work and how you can get them configured in your Kestra instance. I'd love to hear how you're using worker groups in your scenario and how we can improve this feature even more to make it suit your use case. Let us know in the comments below what you think and make sure to join our Slack community.